Thank you for joining. I am joining today and would like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people as the custodians of the Australian Capital Territory and the surrounding region. We also acknowledge other traditional owner groups from surrounding regions and families that have traditional connections to these lands. I'm Jodie Gunn. I am the CEO of the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, a peak body that represents private land conservation, seeking to drive the protection, management and restoration of privately managed lands across Australia. Nature's central role as a keystone of our well-being, our food security, our economies and our cultures is well recognised. From Parliament to community, around dinner tables and board tables, at farm gates, at school gates, society is taking note and taking steps to remedy the declining condition of our natural environment. And so together we are driven by our collective responsibility to stem the tide of loss and decline that we are seeing. So in response, we're seeing innovative collaborations, long-standing partnerships, really visionary thinking, that are all unlocking finance. They're galvanising action and they're forging networks to amplify the ongoing urgent management, protection and restoration of country. As we warm up to ALCA's annual Private Land Conservation Conference, which will be held on Ngunnawal country in October, there are 4 webinars that are showcasing the importance of unique and diverse partnerships across industries and also partnerships across cultures. We're excited about the stories that we'll be able to share as we make our way towards PLC 23. So to kick things off today, we are going to hear about the Murray-Darling Basin Balanced Water Fund. This is a partnership between Kilter Rural, the Murray-Darling Wetlands Working Group and the Nature Conservancy Australia. And I'm joined by a fabulous group of people today with me. Annette Salkeld, Nature and Agricultural Landscapes Manager from the Nature Conservancy Australia. Annette has a passion for working in industries that connect people with their environments. She's worked with environmental NGOs, local government, the international development sector, communities across the Asia Pacific, all to build resilience to the impacts of climate change and disaster. Ewan Friday, thanks for joining us. Ewan is the CIO of Kilter Rural. Ewan is an experienced senior financial and commercial operator, having spent time working across finance, sales and director positions in the private sector, growing institutional organisations' turnovers. At Kilter Rural, Ewan has been integral to the establishment of their water business, which manages assets across all major classes of water entitlement on issues in the Murray-Darling Basin, and Ewan now heads up Kilter Rural's investment team as well. And Dr. Deborah Nias, the CEO of the Murray-Darling Wetlands Working Group. Deb has held numerous director positions, including now as a director of the Water Trust Australia, in addition to her day job. Deb's got over 25 years experience in natural resource and landscape management in Australia, with a focus on community and stakeholder engagement. She has a PhD in wetland ecology, so with water environments being close to her heart, in particular, the way cross-sector stakeholder engagement can maximise the outcomes for water, the environment and the community. So I'm super excited to have such an excellent panel joining us to talk about the fund today. Before we get started, a couple of rules for engagement. You are all on mute, so you should only be hearing from our panel speakers, but you can engage with us through both the chat function and the Q&A. Both are open. So please do start using the chat function. Do enter your acknowledgement of the country that you're dialing in from today, just to get practiced and warmed up. And do use the Q&A function only for questions. Do enter them as they come up in your mind as the presentation goes on. Uptick them if you can, so that we can prioritise the questions that most people want answered, and I'll facilitate a session at the end. So we'll start now with an introduction about the partnership from our panel. I'll then facilitate a bit of Q&A to dive a bit more deeply into their work, and then we'll open it up to the questions that are coming through from the panel. So Annette, over to you to kick us off.
Okay, thanks, Jodie. I'm just getting our screen up. That's up and running? So thanks everyone, and thanks so much, Jodie, for that great introduction. As she said, we're here today to talk about the Murray-Darling Basin Balanced Water Fund, which is a partnership between the Nature Conservancy, the Murray-Darling Wetlands Working Group and Kilter. And we all have very sort of intimate and defined roles and active roles in managing this fund. But before we get started, similarly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today, which is the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation, but also of the traditional custodians of all the areas that we work with on behalf of the Balanced Water Fund across the Southern Murray-Darling Basin, and recognising the expertise and the care and the land management that has been implemented by traditional custodians in the past and continues to this day, honouring the elders past, present and emerging of those lands as well. In this presentation, we're going to tag team a little bit between myself, Ewan and Deb, and talk through some of the aspects of the fund and the partnership and how we work together to deliver on this fund. So I'll start first by handing over to Ewan to give us a bit of an overview of how the fund works.
Sorry, mute always gets you. Thanks, Annette. I guess I'll just start at a high level, really, to try and provide a bit of an introduction as to the mechanics. And the fund was established based on a water investment model that Kilter Rural had been implementing since 2008. And the water investment model is really quite simple. It's really about buying a portfolio of water entitlements and then creating products with those entitlements that serve the needs of the irrigation farming community. So, at its simplest level, it's really about, buying entitlements and then creating lease products. And that enables farmers to access water without either being subject to the fluctuations of buying water in the spot market, which can be really volatile, or using their limited financial resources to having to go out and to buy, water entitlements in their own right. So, we got together with TNC when they'd been, having these conversations with the Wetland Working Group and talked about the implementation of a model that would enable both the delivery of financial outcomes alongside impact, predominantly environmental, but also some social and cultural objectives as well. So what we do is that we've bought a portfolio of water entitlements, we've implemented the investment model, but then we've got an overlay that's hardwired into the constitution of the fund, which requires the fund to make both water and cash donations to an environmental water trust that then uses those resources to undertake environmental activities. So that's a really important concept within the fund, that there's this, hardwired separation of duties, and that enables us as the fund manager to focus on optimising the financial outcomes for the investors within the constraints of the Constitution. And really the magic in the sort of environmental component of it and how it intersects with the financial is that the model makes larger donations when it's wet and the opportunity cost is low, because when this water is abundant, then allocation prices are low. So the fund is able to make a significantly larger donation with relatively the same impact as if it would made a small donation when during a period of scarcity and water allocation prices are high. So that's the fundamentals as how it works. And so on the one hand, it's delivering the water and the donations that enables the Wetland Working Group to go out and deliver that to wetlands. And on the other side, we've got this really, great investment model that's able to provide asset-backed returns to investors that have very low level correlation to other investment assets. And it also supports the needs of the irrigation farming community within the Southern Murray-Darling Basin. So that's sort of the model in a nutshell.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. So I'm just going to go into probably a little bit more detail of how the partnership works in delivering on this fund. And as Ewan has said, the three organisations are all very much involved and have very sort of defined roles and expertise in delivering this. So Kilter Rural, as the financial operator within this partnership, they are the trustees of the fund. They make the investment decisions around what to buy and sell. They raise the funds from investors and manage those relationships with the investors, and they are the link directly to those investors as far as information flow. So that's separated from the work of the impact side. They have to have that financial license to be able to operate in that realm, and that's their key responsibility. You know, part of that, they donate sort of an allocation of water every year and some finances to help deliver that water for the impact side. You know, in the middle here, we have the Environmental Water Trust, which is a separate trust entity, a public fund, which receives those donations and has the accountability for delivering on that. So that Environmental Water Trust is governed by the Nature Conservancy and the Murray-Darling Basin Balanced Water, the Murray-Darling Wetlands Working Group, sorry, Deb. And you know, together we oversee the impact side of the fund. So it's an arm length from the impact in the investment decisions that are made. So the Nature Conservancy sort of administer the fund on behalf of the board. They have the oversight of the impact side. We also have a social, scientific and cultural advisory committee that's made up of water experts, academics. We have First Nations representation on that as well. They provide that peer review of the annual plans and the processes that we have to ensure that there is that rigour and that we are delivering on what we've said we're going to do, and there is that scientific rigour behind it. And we have the mechanisms in place to be able to demonstrate that. As the delivery partner, the Murray-Darling Wetlands Working Group have been engaged by the Environmental Water Trust to do the on-ground work. They're an environment organisation that has the expertise in wetland restoration and water management, and they're really well positioned to be able to do that work. So they do the annual planning of where we deliver water to what wetlands, how much, for what purpose, and so on, along with the 5-year environmental water plan. They do all of the engagement with the landholders, which is a really critical part of this process as well, to ensure that the sites are available, that the landholders are on board, and we have those sites available to be able to deliver the environmental water. They're also responsible for the monitoring of the impact on the ground to ensure that, you know, the aims of what we're doing are you know, being monitored, and we can see that annual from year to year, but also over time, sort of what are the trends of the impact of, you know, the overall fund. So all of those distinct roles are very clear and well documented and agreed to, and were agreed to at the outset, which is a really important part of this whole process. And across the three organisations, particularly in the last few years, we've had a very strong focus on communications, and we plan our communications across the board very closely together. You know, one, to ensure that, you know, the impact that we're seeing on the ground can be communicated externally, to ensure that, you know, we are, you know, holding ourselves accountable and that impact is being demonstrated. And that's really important, that the investors are receiving that information so they know that what they're investing is actually having that on-ground impact. But it's also telling our story and the success of this fund to a wider audience, whether that's governments, whether that's businesses or the general public. It's for us really important to get that story out of what we're doing. So I will hand over to Deb to talk about a bit of the history of the fund and how we got together.
Thanks, Annette. How it developed it's quite a story. It sort of really goes right back to almost 1999, when the working group began to manage water for the New South Wales government. And part of what we did was we were allowed to trade it, temporarily trade it. And so the idea of using the water market to promote and look after wetlands was, you know, very new, and we were able to do that. So we started doing that sort of work right back then, but over time, the New South Wales government took a greater control over the water entitlements that we were managing, and grew their portfolio considerably, and we decided that it was a different sort of path that we would go down, and we established ourselves in as a company and started looking at this model further. Back in 2003, the Environmental Water Trust was developed by the New South Wales Nature Conservation Council, in fact, and they were thinking deeply about how to use water markets and funds to do essentially what we were doing in a more sort of long-term permanent way, I guess. A couple of key people that were involved with that Conservation Council kept those ideas going and started developing them further. The idea being that people might donate water to the trust, which could then be used out in wetlands, etc. Really around about so that was about 2003, and that work was very much run by Catherine Ridge and Bruce Donald. And in 2006, I met Kathy and Catherine Ridge, and we also had a conversation around this sort of idea. And then in about 2013, I met Brian Richter from the Nature Conservancy Global, and we had a conversation around impact investment, and he understood that the impact investment side of this would be a great appeal for an American market, for instance, trying to think that through. And he went back to TNC Global, and we soon began work as a result of that meeting with Brian. We soon began work with TNC Australia. So we were in contact with TNC Australia, and then we were in contact with Kilter Rural. And so that sort of began at around about 2013, and it got, the work developed very rapidly. It was a lot of hard work, I've got to say, a lot of enormous numbers of people involved, and a lot of intellectual grunt went on. So it happened around about 2013 that we started moving it on. But I guess the genesis of the idea of using water markets, like what Ewan was saying, using water markets in this space, the genesis of this has come about from several different angles. And I think it's the marvelous thing of everyone sort of coming together at some point, understanding that we're all sort of thinking things in a similar way and thinking this through about how we can use a water market, how can we get outcomes on ground that are additional to what the government would do. So that's kind of where we came from, I guess. Yeah, next one, Annette. So I was also going to speak to the impact. So I think I think we get the best job out of the three of us, because we get to do the playing in the wetlands with the water, and we get to see the frogs, and we get to see what happens. It's just fantastic. So we have delivered over 11 gigs of water to 11 gigalitres of water to different wetlands across essentially New South Wales and Victoria, mainly New South Wales. And this season we'll be having another 4.5 gigs coming through as well. So we've had, we have a rolling number of wetlands that we use. There could be as many as 15 or 20 wetlands get watered in a particular year, but we have a sort of a portfolio, a developing portfolio of probably around about 50 or so wetlands that we consider each year as to whether or not it's appropriate to water them. As the dot points show, we've had 46 species of water birds and 34 threatened plant and animal species. These are the ones that we've seen, of course. I'm sure there's more there. These are the ones that we've monitored and seen for ourselves. Ewan can speak to the competitive financial return for investors. They've certainly, it's worked for them as I understand it. And yeah, it's proved to be a successful investment, and it's improving wetlands in many places across the basin. Back to you, Annette. Oh, it's back to me again. So these are some of this is sort of like a before and after impact. This is one of the wetlands we work on in Victoria. So on the left, or on my left, you can see the quite dry state. This is quite normal sort of site of a wetland for us. We see this sort of thing quite a lot. Very dry, very cracked soils, dead trees, etc. A lot of people would look at that and say, well, that's not a wetland, but it's amazing when you start putting water in. You can see the result on next to that picture. a lot of rushes start growing, a lot of small ferns, the birds start coming in, of course. It's that sort of very typical boom bust ecology that we have in these sorts of wetlands, particularly in the inland floodplain regions. These wetlands will be watered on a particular sort of regime according to what we're trying to achieve. These are some of the pictures on site around the region. The one with the fellow sitting down with his dog there, that's a wonderful wetland called Rest Down Wetland. It's an excellent example of a organic beef farmer and a winery, so it's very strong agricultural landscape, very dedicated to conservation as well. And we've worked with him for many, many years, trying to improve their wetlands, including an educational sort of area for it as well. The little fish is the Murray Hardyhead, so that's a project there we worked with the Commonwealth Environmental Water Office as well as Aquasave and New South Wales Fisheries Department. This little fish was extinct in New South Wales, and we developed a program to bring them in from South Australia and release them into some of the wetlands around Wentworth, where we're working, a place called Wingilly Station. And they're thriving, they're absolutely thriving. And the recent floods have actually helped to distribute them out even into further broader areas of wetlands. So that's really exciting, having them come back. And then the wetland there, that's a place called Andruko Lagoon, also in New South Wales. It's one of these beautiful Billabong wetlands. That's a great example of a private landholder who sees it more as conservation, not interested in using it for any kind of agricultural purposes, but very much about conservation. And he runs his own business in nearby Mildura. So we've been working on that one for quite some time as well. And the wonderful stilt up there, thanks to a man called Chris Saras, who some of you probably know, a fabulous photographer, totally recommend his work. Beautiful pictures that he produces for us as well.
Okay. Thanks, Deb. So the fund, it's been going for nearly 7 years now, and there's obviously a lot of lessons that we have learned along the way. And just, talking through some of the lessons about the partnership, sort of being the focus of the session today, I think it was really important that, together we had that shared vision of what we wanted to achieve. The different partners might have come from, different angles and had their different sort of objectives for their organisational purposes. But I think together we had that common vision of what could be achieved by this fund, and that's been playing out over that time. One of the things I think that has been really important, and we've sort of alluded to, is that there's a really strong governance process in place for the fund, and that was established at the outset through a constitution that defines sort of what the fund does and what they have to do as far as the environmental impact. There's also clear responsibilities between the different organisations that have been sort of enshrined in legal agreements between ourselves. So it's very clear what our responsibilities are, what our accountabilities are. So there's no argument about who does what or who should be doing what or who hasn't done what. It's very clear from the outset, and that really works well because there's no second guessing what we're all doing. Each of our partners, each of us have our roles and strengths, and we bring different skills to it, and we've really had to draw on all of those skills to be able to put together a fund like this that really does require sort of different ways of looking at it, from the financial side, the environment side, understanding that impact side, and using the lessons from our organisations that we can bring to the fold and have brought to do that. Obviously partnership development takes time, and setting up this fund did take some time to do it, and there was a lot of different people involved. There's lawyers involved and different experts involved, but at times difficult discussions where we needed to work through issues to ensure everyone agreed on it. So we all had that willingness to have those hard discussions, to work through those issues, and it really built up sort of a trust and commitment to this work. And now our relationships are very strong, and we can continue to have the discussions that we need to have, and rejoice in the achievements that we make together. as we've gone on, the context has changed, the needs have changed, and it's continually working at that partnership to work through the different contexts that we have. The last year has been very wet, for example, with the floods that everyone would be well aware of, and that's, we've had to be flexible enough to be able to manage that and deal with that and ensure that we're still seeing the impact that the fund wants to achieve. Being that flexibility, having that flexibility and sort of working through those issues. And we're also, all of us, open up to new opportunities, and new opportunities have arisen, and we've had partnerships, between our different organisations working on different projects. And that's really come about because, we really understand how each other's work, how we work, what our capabilities are, and being open to be able to say, how about this or how about that, and that's proven quite successful as well. So it's formed a really strong partnership that it's been a long-term partnership from the outset, and hopefully that will still keep going for some time. And then to hand over to Ewan for some more lessons around the fund side.
Great, thanks, Annette. And, I think that I'll just like to reiterate what Annette had said, that it's, so much of the success has come from the investment up front to get governance right, so that each member of the partnership knows exactly what's required of them, and there's that proper alignment between responsibility and accountability. But, for the thing to work, we all had to come together with the same determination to want these outcomes. That's obviously enormously important. And fortunately, we were operating in a model with the water market in Australia, which, is probably an unsung achievement of Australian government, really, when you look at how it works compared to other parts in the world, that enabled this fund to work. So, we had a shared vision, and we had an operating platform or environment in this market that could actually facilitate what we were trying to achieve. And I guess that sort of goes to the next point, that it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all model, because this has been tailored to the environment that we find ourselves in relation to the market, the way you can move water around so that you could, have wetlands in all sorts of different places because of, this great infrastructure that we've got here to enable this to happen. I guess, from a fund perspective, it's been a joy to be part of it, because we have such happy investors. It's been a fund that has really delivered on its label. We went out to market in 2015. We were talking about delivering investors a return of sort of 6 to 9%, and over the journey, it's now done just under 13% annualized since inception back in 2015. So they've been very happy on that front. But more to the point, they get all the reporting and the good work that comes through DEB and TNC that we keep them informed of the environmental outcomes, and that's what they said they lined up for. So it's been a real win-win there. But it is important, you need to obviously keep people engaged and be very conscious of the fact that you're managing people's savings. There's a lot of responsibility that goes with that. So, that's just the second last point there, that, success actually, boils down to doing what you said you're going to do. And again, we've got to continually learn and adapt, but it has been also very pleasing that the fund has, because of all the work that was done up front, it has been able to work its way through, some really wide variations in seasonal outcomes and come through and deliver environmental outcomes. And, in spades, I think it's, without question, made the largest private environmental water donations on record in Australia, and at the same time delivered those returns. And we're pleased to see it's growing to it's nearly $100 million of water assets that are in the fund these days. So it's a really great story, and obviously we're enormously proud to be associated with it.
Okay, well, that's sort of our summary of the fund. Thanks for the opportunity for us to talk through this, and I guess happy to take questions and have a bit more of a discussion around it.
Thanks so much to the panel. It was really fantastic hearing much more in detail about the project. Certainly left me with a number of questions that I'll ask, and I can see there are some questions in the Q&A already, so start having a look through those, and please do add any questions to that. I'll bring them into my set of questions where I can, but I'll go to them as well at the end. So I'm trying to understand a little bit more, so I've got a couple of questions about the kind of project itself, about understanding the concept, taking it back to the beginning. Deb, it was great to hear about the history of how it came to be, but can you describe a bit more what problem or challenge was the concept actually seeking to solve? Can you just sort of just define that a little bit more? What kind of operating environment, environmental context, social context are we operating in for this kind of project to come up?
Yes, sure. I guess a lot of the thinking was many of the wetlands that we come across have got real issues around not having sufficient water or not having water at the right time. Sometimes actually they have too much water as well, and so drying out is part of it as well. But it's about understanding that private landholders, most of the wetlands in the Murray-Darling Basin are on private property. And so if you're serious about wanting to look after wetlands, you need to deal directly with private landholders. That's where most of them are. And we've always had that attitude. We always wanted to work with private landholders in that space. Now, with a lot of the government projects around watering of wetlands, it was like the Living Murray, for instance, and it focused on large icon sites. And so we saw that a lot of those private wetlands that are sort of in between all those icon sites, of which there are thousands, they were basically being missing out on what the wetland needed. So that's where we thought the niche was. That's where we thought the need was in particular. We also understood that the landholders and the irrigators and agriculturalists that we worked with were quite champions of the sort of work that we were doing. They did realise how important having these sorts of wetlands on their properties were, and they wanted to look after them. They didn't necessarily know how to or how to go about it, and so we were able to work that through with them. So that's really where we felt it was a need. In terms of why the fund or why do it this way, well, it was, I guess, our group's desire to remain independent and to follow our strategic direction as we felt it was the way to go, which is again focusing largely on private wetlands. We knew the cost of how to deliver. We knew how much it costs to deliver because we'd been doing this already. We'd already been using water markets, so we understood that this was a really great way of getting some of those outcomes. We didn't necessarily understand the exact mechanism of how that might work, and that's why there were, far more intelligent people in the room than me when it came to all that sort of decision making. But that's where we came from as a working group, was this desire to continue our work, expand our work, and have a sort of a surety around finances. Every single conservation organisation will understand that, and also a surety around what the water sort of volumes would be looking like and how we could manage them. So that's where we came from.
Yeah, great. And then so a little bit of a follow-up to some of that. How do you perceive that, and can you describe maybe from your different stakeholder context that different stakeholders value? How do you perceive their value of environmental water and the impact that the fund has been having across the landscapes that you operate? You talk about the private landholders you're working with, you'd have a particular stakeholder group. You've talked about your investors. How have their responses been to this? And how have you managed any potential conflicts around any perceived real or other value?
Do you want me to go to that, Annette?
Yeah, you jump in first.
Yeah, I'll address it. Look, I think it's actually been quite easy from our perspective in that regard, because the product is true to label. We said what we were going to do, and we've done what we said we're going to do. So that was quite easy. And because the Constitution is so defined, we don't have any judgment calls along the way. It's not like, oh, well, we make some more water available to the environment this year, or should we generate some more returns to investors? It's, there's a black letter law. It's this type of season. We have to make these donations, and that's okay. We set those aside and we get on with trying to optimize the financial outcomes, within that framework. So we just don't have those conflicts of interest.
And I would say, I think, externally, when we're looking at, other organisations, government representatives, I think it's been well received because, as Ewan said, we've shown it can work, and there is a place for the private sector in delivering impact on the ground for the environment. And it's been very popular, even with groups who, there are obviously contentions over environmental water and environmental flows, and this is seen as separate to those environmental flows. We're not seeking to replace, anything under the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. There's requirements under that for the government, but this is, something separate to that, which, irrigators and others can appreciate, because we are looking at different mechanisms of how to both support, the farming industry through sort of the mechanisms of the fund, as well as that impact. So it's like a win-win situation that, everyone can see something positive in it. And generally we've got really positive responses around that, because it is, innovative in its approach, and, I'm really looking to bring sort of that money from the private sector into biodiversity and conservation.
Yeah.
There's just another to make there, Jodie, and it's, when you think about stakeholders, you couldn't get a sort of stakeholder group that's more committed to making water available for irrigators than the National Irrigators Council. And so, we, as members of it ourselves and attending those meetings, we've presented on the fund. And what's really interesting is the positive reception that it's received there. And fundamentally, what they found really interesting about it, and that they sort of, and it's probably one of the most powerful things about the fund in terms of as an exemplar, is to consider water not either for irrigation or the environment. It can be for both, but just at different times. And so that was really a concept that resonated with that group. And, and I think it does more broadly as well. It's not the solution to the entire environmental issue, but it certainly can play a part. And so, we think that's a really important message.
Yes, it takes me to, and Deb, you can sort of touch on the previous question, but possibly also responding to this question, which goes to the technical. So, and there's also a technical question in the Q&A that I'll lean into as well, which is, how do you manage? So, just from a technical perspective, talk it through. I'm not a water irrigation expert, and I'm not familiar with all the infrastructure that obviously sits around all of these projects. How do you manage the water allocations between seasons or between years? You've touched on that a little bit, you, and maybe Deb, you can describe some of the technicalities around that in more detail. And flowing on from that question is another technical question around, does the water fund donate only allocation to the Environmental Water Trust, or does the trust hold permanent entitlements as well? So if you can touch on some of those technical questions, that'd be great.
Do you want to take the last ones first, Ewan, around the allocations, because that sets the scene?
Yeah, I mean, no, the Environmental Water Trust doesn't have its own entitlements generating allocations. It receives all of its allocations by way of donations from the fund. Do you want me to talk more in detail about how those allocations come about, Deb?
Yeah, sure. Yep.
Yeah, so effectively there's a formula in the Constitution, and the formula drives the mechanism that says, we've got 4 graduations of season, and in a very dry year we make a 10% donation. So 10% of the volume that comes out of the water portfolio will go to the environment. And in a very wet season, it'll be up to 40% of the water goes to the environment. And obviously there's the 20 and 30 in between. And how we work out what is a wet versus a dry season is that we take a measure of the total volume in storage in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin. Storage is as at 30 April leading into the season. And we say, okay, how does the volume, combined volume in storage compare to a data set going back to 1980, and what quartile does it sit in? So are we coming into a wet season or a dry season? And then there's a mechanism that can follow up later to see whether we were right or wrong and make an adjustment for the next season. But it's all hard, external data driven, so that we know. We've just had a meeting with the advisory committee of the fund, and we've presented the plan, and we know exactly what the donation is going to be next year, because we know what the volume of water in storage was on 30 April, etc. So it's just formulaic in terms of how we make those allocations, and we transfer that water physically, well, through the system, because that's the beauty of being in this system. It's easy to transfer water allocation to an account that enables the Wetlands Working Group to access it and deliver it to a wetland.
Thanks, Ewan. Deb, did you want to?
Yeah, well, I think that explains that really well. In terms of, so at the beginning of the year, as Ewan says, we will have a bit of a, we'll get a heads up. This is what you're going to be looking at managing for the next year. And we will look at our rolling portfolio of wetlands to see which ones are due for watering this year, or we'll look at the past monitoring and say, well, we actually need to do an extra watering this year, or however it comes out. Each one's completely different. So in terms of the and then we write an annual plan around what we think we're going to do, and this gets submitted through to the Environmental Water Trust, and it goes through an approval process with the advisory committee. In terms of the implementation, there's a lot of technical detail there, which I guess I don't know if I should go into too much because it will bore everyone, but it's essentially we will speak with Kilter Rural and say, well, we need water for these wetlands in this area of the basin at this particular time of the year. And then working very closely with Kilter Rural, they will do their best to make sure that that water is in the right account at the right time. And then it's literally us, then the working group, we fill in a piece of paper, depending on which state it is, and we have the water on our account, our own accounts, and then we deliver it through to the landholder's property or wherever it is we're delivering, depending on where we are. And that could be through pumping, it could be through opening up culverts, it could be opening up various irrigation infrastructure, for instance. So it all depends on where we are in the landscape as to how we actually do the actual delivery.
Yeah, fantastic. That's really helpful just to set the scene a little bit more for us in the context of some of that technical. Going now to the technical element of the fund and the investment side of things. And again, some questions might be coming back to you, Ewan. These are a mix of questions I've got, as well as some being reinforced through the Q&A, particularly from the Q&A. Ewan, can you characterise your investors' understanding? Characterise your investors' understanding it has low correlations to other investments. Are they specialised in impact investments? And further, any pension or super funds investing to diversify?
Good questions. Predominantly, our investors are family offices and high net worths. The fund is a wholesale fund, so it's not open as a retail investment vehicle. I couldn't really characterise them as to whether they are impact investors, but I presume that all of them have an inclination to have some impact investment in their portfolios. And this has been particularly attractive to them. It has had support by some pretty significant organisations in the impact investing space, like Australian Impact Investors. They rate it. So they write reports on it that make it available to other wealth advisory groups and so forth. And, they've been great supporters of it. In fact, they sort of put it up as their poster child impact investment product, really, because it's been true to label. But so, and it does have some small allocations from some institutional investors, not as great as we would like. But we've also, I guess the other body of investors tends to be endowments and charities. And so we've recently had a significant commitment made to the fund from a large Australian philanthropic organisation. So they're the types of people who, look to this as a product that they want in their portfolio.
Right.
And I guess the advantage of this fund is that we do have the data and the monitoring to back us up, and we do have that really good information to provide to the investors, so it's very transparent, sort of the impact that's having on the ground. So for the investors who really are concerned about the impact and are driven by the impact, they have that information there and they can get into the nitty-gritty of that information. And for the others who are just looking for that financial return, the impact part of it might be a nice to have, and they can read sort of the glossy glossy brochures, but we, as Ewan said, we're true to label, and we do provide, the good information to ensure that, the investors are confident in the impact that we have.
Great. So going on from that, Deb and Annette, perhaps first, and then I'll come to you, Ewan. What were the motivating factors behind your individual organisations getting involved in the partnership? I'm really curious to explore this partnership element a little bit before we think about the future. So yeah, what were the motivations for getting involved in the partnership, and what did you as an organisation need to really grapple with to enter into this unique relationship?
Okay, maybe I'll jump in, and I should say a lot of this work was done by some of my predecessors, but I think for the Nature Conservancy globally has a very strong focus on conservation finance, and globally in different circumstances and different contexts have looked at how to create financial mechanisms that are fit for purpose for the context, that can bring in that private finance into conservation, because as we all know, we're in a biodiversity and climate crisis, and government and philanthropic money is not enough to do what we need to do to repair our biodiversity systems and climate. So, there's been a lot of different trials and experiments of what are those mechanisms that we can draw from. And I think, when this opportunity came up in Australia, in this context, it was looking at, can we, develop an impact investment fund that has that impact. It works on conservation and biodiversity, and it is drawing on the resources of the private sector. And at that time, impact investment in Australia was still pretty new, and it's still not a massive sector in this country. So it's really looking at, can we get something up and running that's going to deliver on all of those things and bring in those resources to support conservation in Australia.
Thanks, Annette. Deb?
Yeah, I think in a way, it's a similar motivation. When we met TNC, we met Brian Richter from Global, and it was clear that the social impact issues were really being thought about greatly at that global scale. And then when we met the local TNC Australia staff, at the time, Rich Gilmore, it was really clear that the same sort of vision and thinking was there. So we were aligned with that big picture thinking. And importantly, both organisations were prepared to take a risk on it, prepared to work through together and take that risk. And then when TNC brought Kilter Rural in, which sort of completed the piece of the puzzle that we had missing, it was really clear that the three organisations had that shared vision. And the Wetlands Working Group is a relatively small organisation. We've been around for 30 years, but we're still a relatively small organisation. We knew it was unlikely we were going to be able to pull something like this off. You needed a big organisation, or a bigger organisation than us, with the sort of access to resources and intellectual property people and lawyers. And Kilter Rural knew the markets extraordinarily well, much better than what we ever would have. So I think it came about that it was relationships, bit of serendipity of meeting people, and all kind of coming together around the table at the right time.
Thanks, Deb. Yeah, coming around the same table at the right time is a theme that comes up quite regularly in these discussions. Ewan, what are the drivers that have led to your organisation's considerations, of the water fund, but also of nature in the context of your business? What is the value proposition for a business and the return on investment?
Well, I guess the organisation, Kilter Rural, was established basically on the premise that, given the challenges that we face environmentally, we couldn't rely on government and philanthropy. The founders of it, that was their view. They'd worked in the public and private sector in the environmental space. And it was, again, a serendipitous sort of coming together between them and the CEO of a large super fund in Victoria, who wanted to make the super fund a sustainable super fund. And they had an idea about aggregating farmland and delivering multiple outcomes, financial as well as environmental. And that's how sort of Kilter got kicked off in 2006. And I joined in 2008, and sort of that was just after the whole water market opportunity came into being, because there was this unbundling of water entitlements from land. And so we pitched an idea to Vic Super about, water investment, which was really the model I described earlier: buy entitlements, create water products for farmers. And everything else that we'd done for Vic Super, we had these environmental KPIs that we were, achieving, whether it was areas revegetated, species, environmental offsets generated. So we had all of these metrics, and we were finding it really difficult to put many metrics over our water investment model that we had with Vic Super. We tried all sorts of things like going up to the Chuo and offering them water products so that they could, maybe scale back entitlement purchases, and we could lease them or provide options. Anyway, they said, yeah, great ideas, but no, we're buying entitlements. So we couldn't do that. And so it was just sort of serendipitous, really. As Deb said, Rich sort of shot me a note one day. I bumped into him somewhere in a different life, and we got together around a cafe in Carlton and said, yeah, this is a great idea. It really aligns with, where we're about. So, it is still core to who we are as an organisation, about putting private money to work in, let's call it a natural capital space, to get returns for investors, but at the same time deliver measurable environmental outcomes.
Yeah, which goes to my next question, which starts thinking about the future. We've only got a few minutes left. Is what does leadership in business look like when it comes to addressing the challenges that you've talked about, the environmental, the planetary challenges, and why should other businesses be considering their responsibilities to nature loss and climate change in the context of their company in ways that you've been considering?
Do you want me to address that first?
That's for you and first, yeah, and then I'll go to the others around further growth.
Yeah, it's been a battle, to be honest. I think that we're seeing a bit of a paradigm shift in this space, particularly in relation to the role that we play as an asset manager, or looking after other people's capital, and particularly the sorts of questions that institutional investors are now making. It's not just a tick the box issue, ESG, anymore. It's like actually they want substance. And so we are hopeful that, in developments like TNFD will be, further catalyst for that type of focus. Disclosure, sunshine is a pretty, powerful, can be a very powerful driver of change. And so, look, we're hopeful everybody tells us that we're in the right space at the right time, even if it's only taken 17 years or something. I think there's very good reasons, because it's sort of part of your license to operate these days.
Yeah, license to operate. Thanks, you and Deb and Nat. Two questions that I'm going to kind of bring together a little bit. But one is, what plans do you have for the future? Is there an expansion? Have you got enough to scale you up or out? And secondly, what lessons, as you think about the future, could you impart for First Nations organisations that might be seeking to establish collaborative arrangements for water holding or use? I'll let either of you answer those questions in 3 minutes.
In 3 minutes. Do you want me to jump in, Annette?
Okay, sure. Yeah.
I've actually forgotten the question already, Jodie. I'm sorry.
So what are your considerations for future expansion, and then lessons for First Nations?
So the model itself is on a 10-year lifespan at the moment, and we've got about another 3 or so 4 years before it's at its end. We will be undergoing a review fairly soon to determine exactly that question. Are we going to continue? Do we want to continue? And what have we learned, and how do we change if we do want to? I get a sense that we all do want to continue, so I think that's hopeful. Is it expanding? The fund is built in such a way that it is meant to go to scale, as Ewan would call it. So the scale, the more, basically, the bigger the fund, the greater it is, the easier it is to get greater impacts, because more water gets donated and more funds come through. So there is an issue with getting to scale. You have to try and get to scale as quickly as you can, and that has obviously been a challenge because it is a new sort of product. With with First Nations people, we do work with First Nations people on several projects, and there are moves obviously there are moves in the First Nation water space around exactly this sort of model of finding developing a water trust, developing their own model around this, so they can have entitlements and allocations, etc., for their own cultural purposes. I think there's a lot of lessons that are in there. We have been in discussion with the federal government around some of those lessons already. We've had some of those conversations, so I'm hoping very much that First Nations will benefit from what we've done and benefit from our experience and move forward on that, because it's needed.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I can echo what Deb has said, and Ewan, and the fund is still going. There's still room for expansion and growth, and I guess we're working on that and looking at how we better communicate and promote the successes and impact that we've had. But I think for us, we've also, looking at the lessons that have come out of the establishment of this model, and, can we apply it to other types of impact investments in other places, focused on other sectors. So there's a lot in there that we can draw on. As I said, TNC, does have a focus on conservation finance, and we are able to draw on this to help inform sort of the next steps that we might go to. So it's really exciting to see, as we said, it's quite a bespoke fund, this one, that's based on the water markets that we have, but it can be translated into other commodities or other sectors. As far as the question around First Nations water, as Deb said, we're really happy to share the learnings that we've made from this and work with First Nations communities to support their endeavours. There is a lot of interest in cultural water and access to water by First Nations communities at the moment, and rightly so, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin, where those water entitlements are exceptionally low. So, it really is what can we pull out of this and share with others, so they can take those lessons as well. We're very open to being able to build on what we've done and share that with others.
Fantastic. Well, we might need another webinar just to do that, because I haven't got through all of my questions, and there's still a series of questions we weren't able to get to today. A lot of which actually, interestingly, including mine and those online, are around the governance side of things to make these partnerships really work, the structures, etc. So another webinar just on governance of unique partnerships is clearly needed. But thank you all. It's been really great to speak with you all, particularly in the concept of these emerging markets that are in front of us at the moment, and the need for private finance. So to hear a little bit, to learn about what you have learned and the barriers, the challenges and the opportunities that you've been facing over the last 5 to 7 years has been really insightful for us. It's a unique partnership delivering water for the environment and community. So thank you, and also to understand the motivations that sit behind your organisations and how you consider your responsibilities for managing water, but also for nature and supporting communities. Great cross-sector collaboration. The recording will be made available in the next week or so do keep your eyes open for that. As we finish up today and thank the panel, we think about the next webinar, which will be a conversation with another Private Land Conservation Conference 2023 partner, Bush Heritage Australia. Bush Heritage Australia is a national not-for-profit conservation organisation that protects ecosystems and wildlife right across Australia. They use best practice science, conservation and right-way knowledge to deliver landscape scale impact. They work with traditional Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the agricultural sector to make sure their impact is deep, is sustainable and collaborative. So we look forward to sharing who their webinar partner will be over the next few weeks. So stay tuned for that next exciting conversation. A reminder, these webinars are the lead up to the incredible conference that will be held in October on Ngunnawal country in October 16 to 19th. Unite for Nature reflects really what we've been talking about, protecting, managing and restoring our natural environment being everyone's business. And we look forward to bringing a diverse range of stakeholders together to explore solutions that we can all be part of. Calls for abstracts are open, so also look forward to hearing from you as you might think to get involved in the conference later this year. Again, Ewan, Deb and Annette, thank you for joining us today, for sharing your insights and facilitating, supporting a very interesting discussion. Look forward to more of these to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Pleasure.